We had a fiddle around with the presentations earlier. I had two presentations, Brian had one, which I thought was about right given the level of content that I'm going to be presenting today. Brian's going to counter my content later, so it'll be interesting to see how that works in action. Thank you to the IT department and for Rachel for getting it all set up. It didn't look too good an hour ago, but hopefully it'll look okay now. My name is Keith Stephen. I am a director of KSA Group. A number of KSA guys are dotted around the room, so they will be able to take questions and meet you later. What I'm going to try and do is take you through company voluntary arrangements, our style. Company voluntary arrangements are much maligned. My marketing manager, Rob, here, says, why do the press always call them controversial? If you see an article about a CVA in the press, it's usually prefaced by the controversial CVA method. Why is it controversial? Perhaps people will ask questions and we'll talk about that later. We're going to look through how we do this, powerful restructuring method, how can we restructure a business using it, and looking slightly wider than just the law, the techniques of turnaround. I'm going to look at very quickly, because we don't have much time, comparison between CVA and pre-pack administration. For those who don't know the acronym, CVA is company voluntary arrangement, PPA is pre-pack administration. If I speak in those, please correct me and stick your hand up and say, what do you mean? Because we tend to get excited when we get going. I'm going to then run through a case study. So the technology part is going to be quite brief. I want to focus on a case study that we did, which thankfully thus far is successful. I've said Q&A at the end. I'm more than happy to take questions as we go through. Stick your hand up if you wish, but I'm conscious that Rachel's watching the clock. So, why don't CVAs get used? Last year was a record. There were over 750 CVAs last year, I think 757 or 747, whichever number it is. Yet the government wants us all in the profession to use CVAs. I think it's because we have insolvency practitioners in my team, and they all agree with me. The insolvency profession has largely ignored CVAs over the years for a variety of reasons. HM government keeps talking about a rescue culture. When have you last seen the rescue culture promoted by HMG? When did you last see them mention CVAs? Constructive reorganisation, refinancing. Perhaps it's too political an issue. And I think a lot of advisors and a lot of, dare I say it, professionals are not up to speed with where the technology is in the CVA marketplace. If you look along this graph here, the bottom line is the quarterly number of CVAs. The top green line is the number of liquidations. What price of rescue culture? The middle line being wound up compulsory, that's red, and blue is for administrations. The very quick chart shows that it's not being utilised. CVA, in my language, is a deal. Most deals are over a period of time, and it's an XP in the pound outcome. It could be 100p in the pound, it could be as low as 10 or 15p in the pound, although not that common. It could be 5 years, could be 10. There is no prescription for this. The thing I like about CVA is there is a control over the situation. We can help the directors control the situation. If you act as advisors and get in there and help reorganize the business, we can then set a time period to do the deal. If you try and do an informal deal with 20 creditors, if anybody in the room's ever tried to do that, it could take you months and months and months. Once the nominated supervisor of a CVA has reported to court, there has to be a defined time period and there has to be a creditors meeting, at which a decision has to be made, even if that decision is to adjourn. But that's what I like about it. Once you've set the timetable, we have to get on with it. I think they're reasonably cost-effective, done well, certainly cheaper than a lot of the other mechanisms. But I put in red here one of the big benefits. It's something I'm going to focus on in the case study later. Okay, very quick history. Sorry to be boring, and I know it's late in the evening and everybody wants to think about the beer. But in 1970 and 1980s recessions, there was no rescue mechanism that I can see. People who've been around that length of time are nodding. Andy's nodding at the front, he's been around since then. Essentially you had liquidation and receivership, and you had a fairly Dickensian approach to debtor issues. And the government asked Lord Cork of Cork Gully, I think at the time, to get set about putting together a new form of legislation, which, to my mind, started introducing the notion of company rescue. Try and save the debtor. If there's a deal that can be done, let's try and find it. Why is that part one of the Insolvency Act? Because people should be looking at that first. That's what the legislator felt. I don't know if Rachel would agree with that, but that's what I think it's about. if you're ever using the word CVA, this is what I would say. It's a very loose framework of rules and regulations that set out the basics of setting out the deal. That's it. There's nothing more complicated than that in the Act, really. There's a few rules about how to hold a creditors' meeting and what to do if you feel aggrieved, and we'll touch on that later. But if you start with a blank sheet of paper and set out a deal, and providing it's fit, fair and feasible, those of us in the insolvency profession will understand those words, and there is a degree of compliance, then if you get a majority in favour, you've got a deal. How difficult is that? We've set out a deal, it's XP in the pound over Y period of time. Do you accept or not? And if the creditors in majority accept, you've got a deal. The good news is, it compromises the debts of the creditors, unsecured creditors. It can't compromise secured lenders' position unless they let you, which is very rare. But it protects the company with a moratorium. From the moment that the company creditors say yes, you've got a moratorium. We're going to hand out later, if George and Russell could stick their hands up, they're out in the room there. They're going to hand out a little toolkit which we've prepared, which is built in Flash and HTML. It'll slot into your computer. It'll take you through all of what a CVA is in a lot more detail. And it looks at pre-pack and so forth. I don't want to dwell on the technology any further unless anybody's got any questions. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just tell you about two pieces of...
75% of value. What value?
It's the value of the creditors who vote upon the day. So if you had £1 million worth of debt, but only 100,000 turned up to vote, either in personal proxy, it's 75% of the 100 grand, not 75% of the £1 million.
Right, thanks.
So that makes it very powerful. We're not allowed to proxy hunt, but the directors can phone up their buddies and creditors and say, please come along and vote. It's amazing how few people don't bother. HMRC always vote, and they're usually one of the larger creditors. Just two things to look at here. Door bar versus alternative security.
Can I ask you a question? Do they actually normally go for it?
Yes.
Okay.
Providing it's fit, fair, feasible and compliant. And those are quite high barriers to entry. These cases here are very important. I'm not going to dwell on them really, save for this point. Those of you who read the press will understand that CVAs are being used to deal with landlord issues where there's a retailer who has too many dark stores or stores that aren't performing. How can they do that? What is the premise that allows a CVA to do that? Well, essentially, it's that case that I showed you earlier, door bar versus alternative securities. Creditors are, it's easy to understand a trade debt or a tax debt. But what is a landlord? He's also a creditor, or she is also a creditor. But they're future creditors for their future rent. If we've got arrears of rent, that's easy to understand. That's a debt, isn't it? What about the debt that's owed in the future? In insolvency language, we call that an unliquidated claim. So a landlord with a 5-year lease essentially might have 5 years of rent due to him every quarter or whatever rate of payment that he gets. How do you value that and how do you bind that into a CVA? This is what we're going to just show you here. A CVA can bind them based on the case law door bar because it was found by the court that that was a creditor. And CVAs bind creditors into a deal. So I'm not going to read the top piece because Rachel's going to do that later. So what this established was unascertained or future or unliquidated claims can be bound in a CVA. Actually, this was an IVA. Does anybody know what an IVA is? Individual voluntary arrangement. So another piece of case law came along immediately afterwards to say, well, is an IVA analogous with a CVA, or is a CVA analogous with an IVA? And the answer was with Canco, yes it was. So you could argue, if you can bind in a future debt under a landlord's and tenant's relationship, you can do that with any contract, I would argue. Any disagreements?
So what value do you attribute? Is it all the value of the future rents when you're sort of talking about 75%?
Park Air Services and a couple of other subsequent cases came along and said, how do you value that? On your toolkit, Park Air Services and various other cases are set out and it says how you value that. Essentially, every creditor in law has a duty to mitigate their claim in insolvency. So you can't come along and say, I'm owed 30 years on this lease and therefore I'm claiming 30 years rent. Essentially, it boils down to this. What is the void period? So if it's empty for 18 months, he has a claim in insolvency for 18 months, plus dilapidation. Is that okay? So, some high-profile examples. Rowan and his buddies are working on things like JJB Sports, Black's Leisure. I don't know if you did travel much, KPMG, did you? Latasca, recent one last week or the week before, Latasca, the restaurant chain, entered into a CVA, all based on this one piece of case law. How do we close off the non-performing store? What about HMRC? HMRC, somebody asked over here, what about them? Well, they have a defined unit called the Combined Voluntary Arrangement Service, or VAS, Voluntary Arrangement Service. There's a structure in the UK we all know. You've got tax collectors, field officers, they're exercising restraint, they're trying to collect money. It ain't working, so they pass it on to who? Enforcement. Enforcement says, pay up or else. I am now losing my patience, and I will pass it to the insolvency department, and they will issue something called a WUP, as we call it, or a winding up petition. Before they do that, they will always issue a 7-day warning letter. Can everybody put their hands up who's seen a 7-day warning letter in the last 6 months? A few. The answer is they're more common than you think. It is the last statement that the revenue makes, or the HMRC makes, before they go on to wind the company up. Okay? They want the money, but they won't wait. So, HMRC won't support CVAs. Wrong. HMRCs will, once they've issued a 7-day warning letter and a winding up petition is issued, they will still support a fit, fair and feasible CVA, is our experience. Very briefly, in administration, my belief is, if you're looking at a CVA versus an administration, the directors are going to look at these issues. They're not in control once the administrator is appointed. Somebody's got to buy the assets. What if there's no buyer? Statutory investigation once it's liquidated. Marketing damage, the collateral damage to the brand, the business can be quite extensive. I'm not saying administration doesn't have its place. We do administrations and pre-packs. I'm not saying it doesn't. However, there's this so-called stiffing of creditors that the press can't stand. This is the big press issue, isn't it? This is why pre-packs have been under attack. Statement of Insolvency Practice number 16 sets out rules for IPs, insolvency practitioners. It says you must talk to the creditors, you must talk to the shareholders, you must talk to the bank, you must talk to HMRC before you do the deal. So that, to my mind, has taken away a lot of the power of the pre-pack. Why not use a CVA and hive the business down instead? We'll come back to that later. The one big downside of the CVA is we have to file at Companies House a certificate saying the company's in a CVA. Bang goes the credit rating. There is no credit rating after that. That is a major issue for trading, which is one of the issues that pre-pack can address. Bank's cost of capital is another downside. I'm told by bankers that if a company enters into a CVA, their cost of capital internally rises. Hiving it down. What is a hive down? Essentially, we take the business and we put it into a subsidiary company. It has a credit rating. If we all set up a company today, we will have a credit rating of 500 quid and 50 out of 100 this time next week. That's how ridiculous the credit rating issue is. You could have a 20-year-old business that has been successful, cannot get a rating when it's in CVA. So that is the major downside.